11. What I'd like to do today is give a little recap of where we are in the course. I know this is a course with plenty of material in it. Of course, it gives you the opportunity to go through many different things interactively, and there's plenty of videos that show my face to explain things. But I think in addition to that, it's worthwhile for you to just to have a quick recap of what's being covered and to put things into context. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit through where we are in the course right now, what we've done, what we've covered throughout the midterm that you have been challenged by or have nailed. And then I'll talk a little through the material for this week, and I'll end with a kind of a quick overview of what's coming up in the coming weeks, and that will finish the course before you have the final. I will be appearing on screen once more this semester, somewhere towards the end of the course. Of course, the discussion boards are always open, and we're happy to answer your questions whenever you have those. If you feel comfortable going through all the plenty of exercises and practice material in the course yourself, feel welcome to do so. And we're happy to see that many of you are making a lot of progress in the course and doing all the assignments and getting your hands dirty in all the principles of macroeconomics. So let me just start, before I share some of the course material with you here, talk to you kind of face-to-face. The first thing that we've done in the first 2 weeks, well, actually in week 2 and then in week 3, is in week 2 we looked at the 2 big sectors in the economy separately. There's also, in addition to the 2 sectors that we look at, we're going to look at the additional sectors. But the 2 sectors we look at were households and businesses. Those are the 2 big sectors, the household sector and the business sector in the economy. Then there's the government and the foreign sector. We'll cover those in the subsequent weeks after this. So we looked at household decisions and firms' decisions. And, you know, there's many different firms, there's many different households. But macroeconomists tend to think about a few core decisions that households make and a few core decisions that businesses make. The core decisions are how much you are willing to work at the wage that you're getting offered. That's your labor supply decision as a household. How much you consume and how much you save. So those are the household decisions. The 2 things that matter for the household here are the real wage that you get paid as a worker. The real wage basically measures, for an hour of work, how much consumption can I buy? And it's basically the marginal benefit of supplying an hour of labor measured in terms of units of consumption. Then we multiply this by the marginal utility of consumption to translate those units of consumption back into degrees of happiness. And so we're going to, if you do marginal analysis, you're basically going to say, is the utility that I sacrifice by working an hour more, is it more or less than the extra utility that I get from the amount of consumption that I can buy with the wage that I earn in that extra hour worked? That's the household's labor supply decision. Then there's the household savings decision. This is what we call an intertemporal decision, because it compares marginal costs and marginal benefits at 2 points in time. Think of it as today and tomorrow, like we did in our examples. And what you really think about is you can sacrifice a unit of consumption today, then you get some interest payments because you can put the money that a unit of consumption costs aside, get some interest payments over that. That buys you consumption tomorrow, a little bit more consumption tomorrow. Now, how much more consumption depends not only on the interest that gets paid in terms of dollars, but also how the price of whatever you buy increases. So, you know, if you put money aside today to buy milk tomorrow, but the price of milk goes up dramatically, much more than you get paid in terms of interest, then you're actually buying a lot less milk tomorrow, and you might be better off even to buy the milk today and consume it today or even store it. So that's where the real interest rate comes in. It takes into account the interest payments on the savings and adjusts them for the change in the price of the consumption goods. So those are the 2 main kind of marginal analysis, marginal decisions that households make. to determine their labor supply decision, their consumption decision, and their savings decision. We then looked at the households, the data in the household sector, which involves data on how much households consume, how much they work, what the wages are, what the interest rates are, also how much they have saved over time, their assets. So think of that as their balance sheet. That is part of their balance sheet. And so we looked at those data. We were done with the household sector. You know all about it because you've studied it for the midterm. Then we did the business sector, where we looked at the firm's decision of how many workers to hire, the firm's labor demand decision, and how much to invest in different capital goods. And we really focused on the firm producing output using two factors, capital and labor. And it's also buying some stuff from other firms, but when we as macroeconomists add everything up across firms, we net that out because we don't want to double count for that. So intermediate inputs are netted out. So we looked at that. We looked at the firm's labor demand decision and the firm's capital investment decision. And on the capital investment decision, we did something interesting. We looked at both renting capital as well as owning capital. And on the owning capital side, we looked at the user cost equation of capital, which is a specific form of what we call an asset pricing equation. Okay, we worked our way through that. And then we basically could think of the macroeconomy as consisting of three main markets. Markets in which workers supply their hours and that get hired and demanded by firms. That's called the labor market. A market in which households supply what they save, and firms basically buy that or lend this in order to use it towards the investment in the equipment, structures, and intangible capital that they use to produce. That's the capital market. And then the third market is the market in which households buy, and firms also. Households and firms both buy what firms produce, because investment goods that firms actually invest in are also produced by firms. So this is a world without a government, and this is a world, what we call a closed economy. There are no foreigners, there's no foreign sector. It's a simple world, but it's a really useful world to live in, because it really gives you a sense of the main core decisions that macroeconomists think about and analyze, and how we conceptually think about how they hang together in a macroeconomy. So that was kind of the household and the business sector, week 2. You're like, well, why is he reviewing week 2? It's an office hour going forward. I think it's worthwhile to review those things because we'll revisit those decisions by households and firms over and over again. Also, we're going to talk about market imperfections like you're doing this week, or what the role of the government and the role of the central bank, as well as what happens in terms of trade and exports and imports. So these things are the principles of the principles. And getting those down and understanding those correctly and being reminded of them is important. So that's it in terms of the household and the business sector. We've done that. We've been there. We're now going to move on. And last week you worked on equilibrium. And equilibrium was really about those three markets, the labor market, capital market, and the product market. Equilibrium in that together. So that's where we were. And let me start there and kind of quickly review the fundamental insights of what macroeconomics does. Have a little quick review of what happened, what we looked at in last week in week 3, and then discuss what we're going to do in week 4 about market imperfections and about the labor market. And I'll talk a lot about that. And what I'll do at the end of this office hour is I'll briefly discuss also some of the recent data on the labor market that you might have heard about in the news, about recent unemployment numbers and recent numbers on how many people have jobs, payroll jobs. So I'll end with a little discussion of the labor market data, and tie it back into part 4 too. I enjoy doing that because the labor market is one of my particular expertises as a macroeconomist. So my face will disappear from the screen for a moment, and you will largely see course material. Every once in a while I'll reappear back and say hello to you. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the three main factors, questions, and that's what we did in part 3.1. We looked at macroeconomics, looking at equilibrium in all those three big markets together. That's called general equilibrium. And here we're going to really think about the three main questions that we want to answer with this. So let me revisit that simply in the form of this slide. It is it's September 11th, so to some extent it's very appropriate to use New York City as an example here, since it's obviously 17 years ago that the World Trade Center collapsed, and it's been rebuilt in terms of the Freedom Tower that's visible in the upper left picture for New York City for 2014. So macroeconomists ask themselves three questions, main questions. First of all, if you compare New York City on the upper left corner here with New York City, and that's in 2014, with New York City in 1902, there's a huge difference. Now you might not notice it because the buildings might look at the same size, but the buildings on the upper right, 1902 picture, are now the smaller buildings in the 2014 picture. New York City has grown, population has grown, economic activity in New York has grown, the buildings have grown. And since 1902, New York has added a subway system, interstates, and obviously a lot of high rises. And as a result, economic activity in New York has grown, but New York is not alone. Overall economic activity in most industrialized countries has basically steadily trended upwards. And we are now, as citizens, this generation, are substantially better off than the people who lived at the turn of the 20th century. And so what drives this long-run trend in economic growth? What is its engine? Why is it there? What accelerates it? What slows it down? That's the first question of macroeconomics. It's a question about long-run growth, and it really compares the upper left picture with the upper right picture. Now, the second picture is asking, okay, so we see this long-run growth, but it seems like some countries benefit a lot more from this than other countries, and other countries are well behind in terms of economic development. So this is the cross-country per capita differences in real GDP per capita that we're observing. So to see that, compare the picture in the upper left corner, which is New York City, with the picture on the lower right corner, which is the capital of the Central African Republic, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, the financial center of the United States and Bangui, which is the Central African Republic's capital, are remarkably different. You see that there's not even paved roads in large parts of Bangui. There's no high rises, and so the real question is, what causes these big differences between countries? Why are outcomes so different across countries in terms of the levels of economic development? That's the second question we ask. And then the third question we ask has to do with the foreclosure sign that is on the lower right side here, which is, why do economies go up and down along this steady path of economic growth? And those up and down movements are called business cycles. And when the economy does well, like it is doing now in the United States, as we'll see when we look at the recent labor market data, incomes are high, foreclosure rates are low because most people can have the income to pay off their debt. And when the economy tanks and we're in a recession, then foreclosure rates go up, default rates go up, the unemployment rates goes up, and all the good things go down. The amount of employment goes down, the amount of consumption tends to decline a little, incomes decline. So the dramatic co-movement of macroeconomic aggregates over the business cycle is an important thing that economists study as well. Why is this business cycle there? And why do all these macroeconomic variables move together? And so, those are the three core questions, and keep them in the back of your mind because we will talk about them over and over again in this class. And what you've learned in part 3.1 was really to think about all of these economic outcomes that are being studied, no matter if it's long-run growth or whether it is cross-country per capita income differences or whether it's the business cycle, all being determined in a general equilibrium where jointly all these macroeconomic variables are determined together. And that's an important insight. So we actually studied, particularly, we studied how different, how to analyze this whole joint equilibrium. And we did this in the following interactive, where we looked at, on the upper right-hand corner, we looked at the production function, and which really reflects how much output we can produce for a given amount of labor in the economy. Then we looked at what's called the Keynesian cross, the fact that in equilibrium, output should equal spending, because everything that's being produced should be paid out in terms of income and should be should be bought by people. So because production equals income equals spending, this needs to be true. And then, so think of this as the product market. And then we have the labor market, and in the labor market, the labor supply and the labor demand are equated in equilibrium, and that results in an equilibrium real wage and an equilibrium amount of labor supplied in equilibrium. And then in the capital market, the investment demand and the savings supply, so this is the savings supply curve and this is the investment demand curve, are such that are equated, the demand and supply is equated in order to get an equilibrium real interest rate and an equilibrium level of investment that adds to the existing capital stock. So what we did throughout was to basically say, we focused mainly on productivity to keep it simple. We basically said, so what happens in this economy when we make people much more productive? They produce much more output. In that case, what you see is that the production function shifts up. That makes workers more productive, so they get paid a higher wage, because the wage is a reflection of workers' marginal product. It cranks up consumption and investment. It also results in a higher real interest rate. And so everything here moves together. And why is that? Because in response to higher productivity, the labor demand curve will shift upwards along the labor supply curve. Workers, but also because what you save now is going to get a higher return, because you make more money, you want to save more, so the savings curve shifts outwards. And because the firms, when firms invest, they invest in stuff that gets used at a higher productivity level, investment demand shifts up. And so both of these curves shift up in the capital market. Now we're going to go back. We saw Adam was very happy when you crank up productivity, but I really want you to take away from this, I've said this repeatedly, but I do want to re-emphasize this one more time, is all these curves move together in response to this change in productivity. So don't think about the product market alone, don't think for the labor market alone. When you are selling coffee or packing coffee or doing things like that at Starbucks, many of you work at Starbucks, think about how, a person walking in to buy a cup of coffee, their decision to buy a cup of coffee is determined by their overall income level, determined by the overall economic conditions, by the fact of how much they want to consume and how much they want to save, largely determined by overall economic conditions. But if Starbucks wants to hire people, depends on how much demand they expect from consumers. What they're willing to pay to their employees largely depends on how much these employees can actually produce to sell, and again, that's the marginal product, and that largely depends on how productive they are. So, what's useful with all of this is to put this really relatively abstract concepts that we're using in macroeconomics in the concept of your own, in the concept text of your own life. So doing a little storytelling goes a long way. So we did general equilibrium, so all those curves move. I hope you enjoyed that. It's pretty complicated, but I hope that these interactives have really helped you understand why all of this stuff moves together. and why being a macroeconomist is challenging but so much fun, because you're really thinking big picture, large patterns, co-movements in big things. So that was on equilibrium, and then the question is, we keep on talking about markets, the labor market, capital market. We're talking about a supply curve and a demand curve, the price equating supply and demand. We did a whole unit on equilibrium in one single market where we went through all of these examples. So why is it that we really want to talk about markets here? Why are economists generally talking about the market as the mechanism to allocate resources in the economy? So in part 3.2, we looked at this question, and we basically revisited all this kind of the book that's at the fundamentally the start of modern economics, namely Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Now, there's several important insights in that book, but the one that we focused on is one on the role of markets and how they coordinate economic decisions between the supply side and the demand side in both markets. Now, you went through this example in the units yourself, so I don't want to go through the example, but I do want to quickly review that because it puts all the stuff we're doing this week into context. So what I'm referring to is Adam Smith, what some people refer to as invisible hands claim. But really, Adam Smith was the first person to articulate the idea that there doesn't have to be some central planner in the economy, that everyone can make their own decision, and by them interacting and paying each other prices for the things they buy and they sell from each other, these prices coordinate these decisions in such a way that they result in a type of desirable outcome. So in particular, Adam Smith said that every individual neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. And so the main point here is that if we all pursue our self-interest, maximizing our own utility, maximizing profits, the market coordinates those decisions in such a way that it leads to a socially desirable outcome, or at least a potentially desirable outcome in certain dimensions. Now, this is a very wordy, so that I even stumbled on some of the words. It's a very wordy description of what markets do, and to some extent, it was taken as what we sometimes call a conjecture, where people kind of speculate. It's an informed speculation. Now, this insight was so deep that it took economists 175 years to actually prove it. That was done by two economists called Arrow and De Bruijn. But what we learned from this is we really studied situations in which markets work, in which they lead to what we now call an efficient outcome allocation of resources. As you see in the course material, efficiency is not necessarily desirable. The way to think about it, not every efficient allocation is a desirable allocation, but every desirable allocation is an efficient allocation. So efficiency is not a sufficient condition for what we would consider desirable or outcomes we would necessarily strive for in terms of fairness, but it's a necessary condition. It's something we should definitely aim for. So where Adam Smith taught us when and how markets work, We also now, that allows us to identify when markets don't work. And that's what we did in the second part of part 3.2, where we looked at reasons for which markets could not be inefficient. And we thought about distortions. We discussed externalities, where people make decisions. Distortions are cases in which those marginal benefits and marginal costs that are equated by the price mechanism in the market are not really the marginal costs and marginal benefits that should be equated. Because take, for example, a labor income tax. In that case, that causes a wedge between the marginal benefit of the labor supply, or the marginal cost of hiring labor provided by the firm, the marginal benefit of supplying labor by households, because the households are getting a lower net wage than the firms have to pay. That causes a wedge, and that causes a distortion in this coordination mechanism that the market does. Now, market power we gave as an example where this is also the case, where the fact that the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve makes the firm not equate the right margin on its supply decision. And so that causes a wedge between the marginal benefit of consumption and the marginal benefit of, the marginal cost of consumption and the marginal benefit of producing. Because the marginal benefit of producing is not necessarily the marginal benefit that we would think of as being efficient. And so market power also causes a distortion. Market power is discussed a lot these days, so you'll read a lot about it in the news, no matter whether we discuss things like Google or net neutrality, or whether we talk about mergers in healthcare. Often the Federal Trade Commission comes up in these discussions. And so we'll talk a lot about that also in the next week when we look at the role of government. Then there are externalities, and these are really the case where it's fine that we take decisions based on our own perception of marginal costs and marginal benefits, but many decisions we make have marginal costs or marginal benefits that are beyond ourselves, that we don't take into account, that are external to our decisions, and that's why they're called externalities. If those are the case, we're not really looking at the socially desirable marginal costs and marginal benefits. Smoking is an example that's here in the notes. Pollution is an example. But positive externalities like coming up, recording, composing a fantastic song that the world can enjoy for generations to come. Mozart probably didn't take into account how many people are still listening to his music. And so if he would have realized how many people would have enjoyed this, he would probably compose more. And in this case, taking better care of himself, since he unfortunately died very young. And then frictions are basically types of mechanisms that prevent the quantity and the price to adjust immediately to the equilibrium price. In some cases, they actually never really adjust, and in that sense, they actually can cause distortions. But think of those as kind of mechanisms that slow down the market adjustment back to equilibrium. They're sometimes also called rigidities. Now, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive categories. You can interpret certain externalities as distortions. You can interpret certain frictions as distortions, et cetera, et cetera. But I want you to kind of roughly think in these three classifications. So that's where we were at the end of last week. We had done this. We had asked ourselves, why are markets so desirable? And I mean, the simple observation that market economies tend to result in much higher standard of livings than economies that don't rely on the market mechanism itself should be a sign for you that the market is a desirable way of allocating resources. And we know when the market works, but we also know circumstances under which the market does not necessarily work perfectly. That doesn't mean you have to abandon the market mechanism when there's such imperfections, but there's room to tweak the market mechanism to make sure that there is a more efficient allocation of resources in the economy. And I want you to bear that in mind, because often people tend to be like, I'm very pro-market, I'm very against markets. Really, I want you to, if you go through this course and you think through the course material, I hope that you realize that it's not a bit being a pro-market or against market. It's thinking through what are those possible tweaks? Are they desirable? What are the costs of tweaking, and what are the benefits of tweaking the market mechanism through taxation, through regulation, or through innovation, like coming up with something that overcomes rigidities, or that reduces distortions, or that makes people internalize externalities. Take those technologies, and there's plenty of examples of those. Those are all important things to think about. They're both opportunities as well as policy questions that are useful to know about. And when you simply have this mindset that you don't like the market or you do like the market, and a lot of politicians talk like this, I don't like the market, we should have the government provide all healthcare and there shouldn't be a market for it, or there should be totally privatized market for healthcare. Those are very kind of black and white descriptions of how to think about the market mechanism. So what I hope is that you, at the end of this course, you have a slightly more nuanced view of how markets affect the overall macroeconomic outcomes, and how certain things can be tweaked one way or the other. That doesn't necessarily always have to be the government. It could also be businesses, but a real kind of sense of knowing when the market works, and also knowing how we can make it work better. And in order to learn that, this week, you're going to look at 3 markets in part 4.1, where we know that there is notorious market imperfections. The first one is a market where the government often intervenes. This is the market where goods are either non-excludable or they're non-rival, and you'll work through that. Those are different types of public goods and quasi-public goods. So work through that section. I won't cover that for the rest of this office hour. I think that section is pretty self-evident. It contains a lot of examples to work through, and I hope it really makes you think about, okay, so what types of goods is there are clearly provided by the market, and what types of goods aren't not so clearly divided. If a good is non-excludable, then it's really hard, because you can't exclude other people from using the good after you produce it, to really get all the revenue that you need in order to cover the cost of production. If a good is non-rival and you produce something but other people like Mozart music, other people can infinitely enjoy it, and then, the fact that I listened to Mozart's horn concerto yesterday doesn't reduce someone else's utility from listening to it tomorrow. That is a clear example of a positive externality. So that the first part of part 4.1 will cover that. The second part covers the market of knowledge, that you're a part of yourself by following this course, but it also includes innovation and ideas as well as education. Go through that part. You'll see it has a lot of characteristics of public goods, and non-rivalness comes up again. But I want to focus here mainly on the market for medical care, because there's so many different imperfections that I think it's nice. I also like covering the market for medical care in this part, because Ken Arrow, who was one of the people who won the Nobel Prize for formally proving the mathematical theory between Adam Smith's conjecture, then wrote a famous paper saying, okay, this is all nice and good, and the market works under certain circumstances, but here's a market that absolutely does not work according to what results in efficiency, or according to what we call the first welfare theorem. He wrote a famous paper in the early 60s, and that paper itself spurned an all different field in economics, namely basically the field of health economics. And so to go over the imperfections in that market, I won't have you read Arrow's paper. I'll give you a bunch of slides, but it's useful to go over those and really think about what is it that's so difficult about organizing a market for healthcare. What that also does is really help you understand some of the policy discussions related to healthcare that are going on not only in the United States, they're going on about the national healthcare system in Canada and in Britain, or about market-based healthcare reforms in the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, or healthcare reforms in France. All countries struggle with this in different ways because they have different policies. But this is a question that's not unique to the United States, but it covers a lot of these imperfections. It helps you think through imperfections more. So let me go to that. What I'm going to do with you is I'm going to cover this unit, um, which is unit 4143. And let me go to the first page first. So this is a unit about healthcare market imperfections. And it starts off by first defining the market and saying, okay, so what's this demand and what's the supply in medical care? And, patients are demanding medical care services from providers. But then there's intermediaries called insurance companies that are also involved in the market. So to some extent, you demand insurance from your company, and your healthcare insurance company. The insurance company then, on your behalf, demands the healthcare services that you need from providers. So let's talk through this market kind of an imperfection by imperfection basis. The first imperfection is that when you go to the doctor, you're not fully informed about what disease you have and stuff. So this is known as asymmetric information. You don't have full information about the disease you have, what you need to get better, and so what this induces is it induces doctors to tell you that you need stuff that you really don't need. This is sometimes called induced medical care. And the estimates of this are that it's actually the fraction of treatments in medical care that are being prescribed that people actually don't need can be very substantial. The estimates of how much that is vary, but we're talking tens of percentages. And what's interesting is that countries deal with this very differently. Here in the United States, television commercials for prescription medication are very common. In most other countries, they're actually not even allowed because they are things that talk people into asking for medication that they might not need, and there might be an incentive for doctors to prescribe it because they get money from the pharmaceutical companies. And so in the US, this is treated very differently than in most other countries. So if you travel abroad, if you're an American and you travel abroad, you'll find that those types of commercials are not very common in other countries. The second thing is that there's inelastic demand. I mean, once you have a personal care physician, you're not very likely to go to another one to see whether they charge a lower rate for the services they provide. Or once you found a cardiologist for your open heart surgery, you're not going to ask this cardiologist, oh, how expensive are you? I might go to the competition. But once there's inelastic demand, there is market power. And market power means that suppliers are going to charge a price that would be higher than economically efficient. Now, medical care, the demand is specifically inelastic. And largely this is because, many people aren't even aware of what the price is that the insurance company is actually paying for the service that they're buying. The other thing is that in most cases, it's hard to start a hospital. It's also hard to become a surgeon. It's hard to get your medical degree. And all of these things limit entry into the supply of medical care in the economy. And to some extent, that's good, because we want to know that if someone becomes a doctor, they're licensed to be a doctor. We don't want quackery. So it's not necessarily that these entry barriers don't serve a purpose, but the result of it is that there's only a limited amount of competition among the providers of medical care. And again, that allows them to charge high prices and make large profits. So what does the insurance company basically do on your behalf? In order to reduce the prices that providers charge, insurance companies basically provide negotiation power on behalf of the patients on the demand side of the market. So insurance companies negotiate prices with providers, and this is also why they assess the need for treatment, because they want to make sure that people don't get prescribed stuff that they don't necessarily need. Now, this would all make sense, and this would really enhance efficiency in the healthcare market if it wasn't for the fact that insurance companies themselves come with market imperfections. Because the bigger an insurance company is, the more it can negotiate with providers. the more it can negotiate down the prices, the better it could also potentially assess the need for different treatments. But of course, when the insurance company can provide prices down at this side when it's big on the side of the selling insurance, an incredibly big insurance company itself has market power. So then the market power gets transferred from the provider to the insurance company, the intermediary. And then the insurance company provides, it's going to demand higher prices for consumers, and the inefficiency is going to move to the prices charged from insurance company to patients. In fact, insurance companies have something called increasing returns to scale. The bigger they are, the lower their cost is for producing the services that they provide. That's called increasing returns to scale, where when you ramp up the scale, the efficiency of the operation goes up. But that means that it's natural that the biggest company can basically undercut the price of all the other companies in the market and compete them out of the market. And such a market with increasing returns to scale tends to lead to something called a natural monopoly. But once a firm is a monopoly, it's going to charge inefficiently high prices, and we're back in a market inefficiency. So once the health insurance company has market power, it will charge higher premiums. Now, the final thing that's important in this market, and that's what's being done in, there's also, I've made an additional video on this. The final thing in this market, of course, is that an insurance company, when a patient knocks on the door, doesn't really know that much about the health status of the patient. So there is asymmetric information. And so medical insurance, to some extent, is an implicit subsidy from healthy, who tend to be disproportionately young people, and also tend to be disproportionately higher income people, to people who are not less healthy. They tend to be older, and health is also correlated with income. So and medical insurance has this implicit subsidy structure that's intergenerational as well as across the income distribution. And that causes an effect called adverse selection that's being covered in Part 3.2 as well. I don't want to go into detail on adverse selection. You can study the course material to get there. But there are all these different inefficiencies in the market for healthcare. And it's really remarkable. So I used it in the healthcare market because it's actually a really big part of the economy. In most countries, it's about 12%. In the US, it's even larger of GDP. So because medical care is growing, we're aging, we're using more medical care when we're older in industrialized countries here in the US, but that aging is going on in Germany, Japan, France, many industrialized countries. So we're growing older and we're requiring more medical care, but with medical care come big market inefficiencies. So identifying what they are is important to understand what we want to achieve with different types of regulation and different types of policies. Now, I don't want to go in specifically into healthcare policies. As part of the part 4.1, the third part of 4.1 will, the fourth section of 4.1 will do so, and will cover different policy ways that policies can alleviate these market imperfections. But what I really want you to be aware of, and I want to re-emphasize, is that such a big market that makes such a big part of the economy itself is subject to major imperfections. And there's a role for either the government or for regulation that doesn't necessarily involve the government intervention to alleviate some of those imperfections. Now, if the government would do everything perfect, you would say, oh, let the government do everything. And so a single-payer system is something that a lot of people here in the US are advocating. I do want to kind of ask you, if you advocate that, ask yourself the question, how well is the government going to do when it runs such a system? Now, there's an example here in the US. There's the VA system that's effectively a single-payer system for veterans. And that provides both the healthcare services as well as the insurance. Go and read some of the news about the quality of VA services and ask yourself whether you want to be part of that system necessarily. That's important. You can also ask yourself whether you really want to be in a hospital in Canada or in London, or would you prefer to be in a hospital in, say, Australia or in Germany. Now, of course, many of us haven't traveled that much, but there are people who have, and it's interesting to ask questions about, what would you prefer? What system would you want to be under? If you haven't had the exposure to travel, read up on it. It's a big thing. It's a big decision. And you here in the US, to some extent, you have choices between which healthcare system you're going to be part of. And so being aware of the quality of services provided, being aware of the imperfections, being aware of how much insurance companies limit or allow you to actually get different medical treatments is important, not only for macroeconomics, or clearly this all affects the macroeconomy since it's such a big sector, but it's important for you in your own health. Okay, so far about medical care. The market for medical care might be big, but it's not the biggest market that macroeconomists study. The biggest market really is the labor market. The labor market, most people make up, but make 2/3 of their income in form of wages and salaries and bonuses, stuff they all make because they rent out their hours, they supply their hours to employers, or they use their own hours to produce output as a self-employed person. So what I want to do is I want to use the last 15 minutes of this office hour to talk a little bit through the labor market, which covers for part 4.2 of the course. Let me share my screen with you. So we're going to go through some course material, and then we're also going to go through one data release that just came out last Friday, and I thought would be useful to talk through the labor market report. That is one of the most highly anticipated macroeconomic data releases in the US. That's a monthly data release. So what does the labor market do? Households supply their time and get paid labor income. Labor income consists of the wages and the salaries that people make, but it also consists of overtime pay, bonuses, benefits, things like that. Now, what do firms do? And not only firms, the government also hires, and there's actually some households that hire people, but mainly firms. Firms employ workers. They use the workers' time to produce. It's a factor in production. And they pay this factor compensation. So those are the benefits, the wages, the salaries, the bonuses, other incentive pay, stock options, things like that. All of these things are part of the payments of firms to workers for their hours, for their labor services. So the simple stylized labor market we looked at was a market in which there is a labor supply curve and a labor demand curve. So labor supply is upward sloping in the real wage. The higher the real wage, the higher the benefits of working an hour more, because you can buy more stuff for every hour you work. So the more households are willing to supply in terms of labor, the more they are willing to work. And then the higher the wage, the higher the cost of hiring a worker. The higher the real wage, the higher the cost of hiring a worker for a firm. So the lower the demand, the less workers firms will demand. So we have a downward sloping labor demand curve. What confuses students a lot here is that in the labor market, households are on the supply side and firms are on the demand side. I showed that already to you in the previous slide, but let me re-emphasize that. For the rest, this is like a standard market diagram. The equilibrium price is the real wage. The equilibrium quantity is the number of hours worked. So we could shift the demand up. Suppose the economy is doing really well, firms want to hire a lot of people, then the demand curve shifts out, the real wage will go up, wages will go up, and hours worked will go up. Now, as you see in the labor market report that we'll look at later on, we have a strong economy, employment is going up pretty quickly, but the wages are not going up that quickly, as quickly as we would anticipate, but we are seeing some acceleration in wage growth, consistent roughly with the diagram that I'm showing you here. But remember that the real trick of this diagram, of course, is that Wages always adjust to equate demand to supply. And that's exactly one of the puzzles in the labor market. Namely, let me pull myself up here, there you are. Namely, that it turns out that at most points in time in the labor market, there are always some people looking for jobs. They want to work, but they can't find a job in the labor market at the prevailing wage. And the question is, why don't, if there's more demand, if there's more supply of labor in the labor market than there's demand, then the simple diagram we just looked at would say the real wage should go down in order to equate supply and demand. So why aren't wages going down to equate supply and demand? Why is there always unemployment? And in part 4.2, we're looking at potential explanations of why this is the case. And so what I want to do is show you the unemployment rate, which is kind of a headline figure that you'll hear a lot about in the news. Its historical pattern. Why is that such an interesting question to ask? Because it's indicating that there's some market imperfection that prevents the labor market from adjusting. Then I'll talk you through the labor market report, some of the headline numbers, where we measure sometimes hours, but mostly we measure jobs, how many people are actually having a job that are on payroll at firms. You can also look at people who are self-employed. And then we'll look a little at the type of friction that might actually induce the existence of unemployment, persistent existence over time. So let's do that next. And that means what we're going to do is we're going to look first at the unemployment rate and then at the data that go with it, the data release that goes with it. So here's the plot for the unemployment rate. This plot, the data goes through February 2017. Of course, we're already having data through August 2018, so I'll show you those in a minute. But overall, what you're seeing is that of the people who want to work, so they either have a job or they're looking for work, no, there's always a certain percentage of them that don't have a job, that are looking, that don't have a job. That's the unemployment rate. So how we measure how the people want to work is something that's discussed in the first part of part 4.1. Sorry, part 4.2. So let me just emphasize this time series. One of the things to realize is that there's always some level of unemployment, and there's some estimate of what's a reasonable level of unemployment in the absence of business cycles. That's called the natural rate. It's estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, or one of these estimates is by the Congressional Budget Office. When the economy is doing well, the unemployment rate tends to be below this natural rate. When the economy is in a recession, it tends to be well above this natural rate. Now, I'm plotting this natural rate to make the point that it's actually natural for always to be some positive unemployment. And that's the puzzle. Then the other question, of course, is why does the unemployment rate shoot up in recessions and tend to fall in expansions? So what's the unemployment rate now in August 2000? In August 2018, well, here's the employment situation release that came out last Friday on September 7th. And it's one of the most headline-grabbing data releases that's being released about economic data. And basically, I don't want to go through the whole release, so let me show you a few highlights. The first thing they report is the number of people who are on payroll at businesses that are not farms. And the reason we're not measuring farms is historically because employment there varies a lot with weather patterns. So we're looking at non-farm payroll employment, and this is a measure really about the total amount of labor that is basically being used by firms in production. This comes from firms. Firms report how many people they have on payroll. So this is what we call the establishment survey. Establishments, so different firms run different establishments. Establishments report how many people they are actually have hired and they pay wages to. This is not total employment. There's two other types of employment in the economy. There's people who are self-employed, and then there's people who could be working for their family. So these are called unpaid family workers. So people who work in family restaurants, stuff like that. But this is the bulk of it. It is also the case that you could have two payroll jobs. So it's not necessarily measured in number of people, it's measured really in jobs, because you could hold multiple jobs. This is the headline number. Non-farm payroll employment moves dramatically with GDP. So if it goes up and down, it moves dramatically. Here's the actual monthly increases that you're seeing. What they do, there's a slide in the data that shows this to you in more detail. What they do is they actually, payroll employment moves up and down a lot during the year because of seasonal fluctuations. They take those out and then they look at the increase. And so these are those monthly non-farm payroll increases. And you see that the 201,000 increase that we're having this month in August 2018, or last month, is a pretty high increase. Moreover, it's part of a very steady pattern of increases in payroll employment that we've been seeing over the past year. So we're seeing a very strong labor market where there's a lot of job growth. In terms of the unemployment rate, remember that the data I showed you went through 2017, and since that data, the unemployment rate has dropped further, and it's now at 3.9% for the US. This is a really historically low unemployment rate. So we're seeing, in terms of unemployment and total employment measures, we're seeing a very, very, very strong labor market in the US. This release works as follows. I'm going to quickly talk you through it. It contains questions they ask about households to figure out whether people want to work, whether they're looking for work. So they measure the labor supply by interviewing households. That's known as the household survey data. And then they measure labor demand by surveying establishments about how many people they hire and also how much they pay. So they talk about total employment patterns. They say there's professional and business services. They added 53,000 jobs. Manufacturing is something that comes up a lot here. It says that manufacturing employment actually did not change a lot in August. And then they also tell you how many hours on average workers work, which is 34.5 hours, and how much they make, and how much that's growing. And then they go into great detail throughout this release and talk about other details that I will skip for the moment, because I don't want this class to be a detailed class on data releases. But I want you to be aware that this is actually the actual release from which the data come that you study in this class and that you read about in the newspaper. So that's on the unemployment rate. And then what happens to the unemployment rate? And why is there persistent unemployment in the economy is then a real question. Even now, when the labor market is really, really strong, we're generating a lot of jobs, the economy is doing well, we're still having about 1 in every 25 people who either works or wants to work looking for a job. That's a lot, right? In a very strong labor market, 4% of the people that are in the labor supply still don't have a job. And so to understand this, it's worthwhile to think of the labor market in a very specific way. And that's to think of it as a bathtub itself. So think of the number of people who are employed as a stock. There's inflows and there's outflows. There's people who are being hired and there's people who quit jobs. Once you start thinking in that way, you understand why there's always some people that are not in the bathtub, that are kind of on their way have flown out of the bathtub and are on their way through the plumbing to flow back in. And those people are basically those unemployed people that we're talking about. To do this, let's end this office hour by looking at those notes, by looking at the parts of the course material that cover this. So that was the labor market relief. So the flip side of the unemployment rate is actually jobs that are looking for workers. So the unemployment rate measures workers looking for jobs, but there's also jobs that are looking for workers. Those are known as job openings, and we're seeing now a record number of job openings. In fact, we're having more job openings than we have unemployed people. There's about 6.2 million unemployed people, and the job openings, there's about 7 million job openings. The data on job openings like the data on unemployment by a month, but that's just a minor detail. The big picture remains the same. So when you think of the unemployment rate reflecting labor supply exceeding labor demand, the answer to that is that's actually not the way of interpreting it, the right way of interpreting it. There's also labor demand looking for labor supply. There's something, some friction, some market imperfection that at any point in time makes there to be both workers looking for jobs as well as jobs looking for workers. In the course notes, I explained this in the contents of a dance floor. There's always some people on the side of the dance floor looking for a dance partner. I think that's actually a very good analogy. What that captures is the intuition behind what we call search theory and search frictions in economics. So the reason that there's coexistence of unemployment and job openings is because it's hard for workers to find jobs and for jobs to find workers. Now, what that results in is, every month, some people leave the dance floor and find another partner and enter the dance floor. And these flows on and off the dance floor can be pretty big. So you can think of those in terms of a bathtub, and that's worthwhile doing. So you really want to think of the labor market as a bathtub, where the number of employed people is the number of, the number of employed people at the end of the month are the people who are getting hired. They flow into employment, minus the people who flow out of employment. They separate. That's my dot here, the outflow. And I want to end this office hour by telling you these flows are really big in the labor market. Ask yourself how often you've quit a job and gone to another job. It turns out that every month, about 1 in every 30 jobs in the US, a little more than that, actually ends and someone else gets hired and replaced. So there's, the size of these flows relative to the size of the number of people that are in the bathtub are enormous. And I want to end with some data from Fred, some updated data. Fred at the center was Fed on the number of hires and the number of separations. So this plot plots the total number of people who get hired in non-farm payrolls and the total number of people who leave a job from non-farm payroll. As you can see, these numbers actually, they move together a lot. The difference is actually the change in the payroll employment. So the 210,000 that I spoke about is basically the difference between the hires and the separations. So when hires are bigger than separations, you have an increase in this non-farm payroll employment because the inflow in the bathtub is bigger than the outflow. But look, that difference is small compared to the overall level. In a month, every month, now take just a random month here. Let me point to the numbers for December 2015. In December 2015, about 5.5 million people were hired. About 5.2 million people left their non-farm payroll jobs. Now, even in a recession, the Great Recession was one of the deepest recessions in the United States. In the history of the United States. That doesn't mean that no people get hired. Even in the depth of the recession, 3.5 million people were still hired on payrolls. So to understand the labor market, what I want you to understand is, don't think of it statically. If the unemployment rate goes down and the number of unemployed people goes down from 6.4 million to 6.2 million, that doesn't mean, let me put myself in the picture again. So if the number of unemployed people goes down from 6.4 million to 6.2 million, that doesn't mean 200,000 people have found a job. It means many more people have found a job. It just turns out that 200,000 more people have found a job than lost a job. But the actual flows underneath it are enormous. The labor market is very, very liquid, very dynamic. And if once you understand that, you understand also better how things adjust. You also understand better to think about unemployment. Unemployment in the US, there are some people who are long-term unemployed, but unemployment in the United States is largely a short-term phenomenon. Most people are unemployed end up finding a job very quickly again because of these high rates of flows in the labor market. Once you understand fundamentally that the labor market works like that, that's why you have unemployed people, that's why you have job openings, because they're basically reflecting these people. It's like a big part of musical chairs, people moving from one chair to another, but it takes time. So you have some open chairs and you have some people who are standing up. Once you understand that, you have a much better understanding of how fundamentally the labor market works in the big picture of the macroeconomy, and what type of frictions are leading to this coexistence of the unemployment rate as well as of job openings. So the next time you apply for a job, remember that. Job application has to do with the frictions that lead exactly to that, job openings and unemployment. Okay, I ran a little over time. Of course, if you play this at 2 times the speed, you're going to be just fine. I hope you're going to do well in the rest of the course and study some quacking ducks, as someone asked about. I hope that you continue to enjoy the rest of the course. We enjoy having you and looking forward to your submissions throughout the rest of the course. I'll probably hold a very brief office hour by the end of this 7-week period to kind of answer subsequent questions. Bye.